So I'm a solar guy, and I have to admit I've got a problem. Intermittency. So we need things like tidal power and underground power. We need diversity, just like nature is not a monocrop. Nature teaches us about diversity, so is our energy future. Our next guest is pretty exciting for me to introduce. Show of hands, who here grew up reading Ranger Rick magazine? Who here saw it in the house when the kids had it? Yeah, so the National Wildlife Federation and Ranger Rick is a big part of a lot of our background. Collin O'Mara is the president and CEO of the National Wildlife Foundation. He's going to be coming up here and giving a keynote address. Don't forget nature, lives depend on it. So I'm not going to steal his thunder, I'm going to keep us on track, but again, ladies and gentlemen, Collin from the National Wildlife Federation.
It is wonderful to be with all of you. I left the swamps of Washington at 5 a.m. this morning, and then I kind of woke up on the plane and I was in heaven in this incredible area. And unfortunately, I have to get on a plane in a few hours to go back. There's always another battle to be waged in Washington. When Sally invited me to join this conference, I actually was a little surprised at first, because you have so many of the leading kind of technologists that are kind of really paving the way for the kind of the clean energy future that we so desperately need. And it really is an honor to follow Jim Dielson, who, for those of you younger folks in the room, really is the father of wind in America. Let's give Jim one more round of applause. I first had the honor to meet him, I guess it was 6-7 years ago at an offshore wind conference in Stockholm, in Europe, when some governors in the East Coast were trying to figure out how to bring this kind of burgeoning industry in Europe to the East Coast. And finally, 8 years later, I'm actually really proud to be able to report that several gigawatts of projects are actually in the pipeline right now on the East Coast. But I'm here to talk a little bit about the role of nature. And you know, it might seem a little weird for a renewable energy conference, but my hypothesis for all of you today is that we can't solve the climate crisis unless we invest in nature. We can't hit the targets that we need to achieve unless we reduce the damage on the landscape. There are estimates as high as 11 to 20 gigatons a year of emissions could be mitigated by investing in natural resources in all things that are cheaper than $100 a ton. These are investments that pencil out right now in many cases actually at negative cost or very, very low cost to reduce emissions significantly in every part of the world. But last year, $330 billion were invested in clean energy. It's an amazing number, $330 billion. It was a little down from a couple years before that, but $330 billion, that's a third of a trillion. Less than $4 billion was invested in natural solutions. And those natural solutions could easily be 37, 40% of the overall solution in terms of both reducing emissions going into the air and pulling emissions out of the air. And so we have this massive inequity right now where we're not investing in some of the most cost-effective technology, most cost-effective solutions. And I would argue the reason is that they're not as sexy, right? It's the same reason we underinvest in energy efficiency. You know, Bill Ritter had that great quote about eating your energy efficiency vegetables before you get to your clean energy dessert. We're doing the same thing on the natural infrastructure side. When President Obama signed the climate accords for Paris, there were a few assumptions that were built in there to get to the 26 to 28% reduction. One of them was that emissions would actually be declining from the landscape, primarily from agriculture and from forestry. In the few years since he signed that, and obviously we've had a bunch of challenges with this current White House around the Paris Accords, emissions have actually gone up dramatically from the landscape. We've had fire after fire on our national public lands. Last year, more than 10 million acres burned. We've had 3 of the worst fire seasons, and 3 of the last fire seasons have all occurred in the last 8 years. More than 150 million metric tons of carbon pollution went into the air as a result of last year's fires. Just for point of comparison, all of the energy generating units in all of the 9 RGGI states, where I had the privilege, I was the Secretary of Natural Resources, I was the chair of RGGI for a while, all of those energy generating units together, the coal plants in Maryland and the gas plants in New York, all those plants combined is a little over 70 million. So twice as many emissions coming off our national forests than coming out of the power plants in the Northeast. And the reason I bring that up is that one of the reasons the fires are burning hotter and brighter and longer is because of climate change, of course. But one of the other reasons is because we're not managing our natural resources. Right now, the Forest Service is spending over 50% of its budget fighting fires. 50% of its budget, billions of dollars, fighting fires. Now these fires are becoming more intense. There's less snowpack, so there's less soil moisture, conditions are hotter. You have tinderbox kind of conditions in a lot of places, drought conditions that are escalating. You have pine bark beetles. I mean, I don't have to tell anybody here that's actually from Colorado and the Durango fires that you all faced. But the neglect of the management of these natural resources is exacerbating the problem. There's a steady state of fire damage in this country, about 3.5 million acres or so is kind of an average here, maybe 4 million acres, and that was pretty true for a long time. And fire is natural, right? Fire is rejuvenating. Fire is incredibly important to the health of these ecosystems. But for the last several years, we've been 3 and 4 times higher. And so all that progress we're making, reducing emissions, as folks are fuel switching, as folks are adopting clean energy, and we're seeing the explosion of clean energy across the country, a lot of that's being offset because we're not taking care of the natural resources across the country that can not only reduce emissions going into the air, but actually absorb more out of the sky. And so right now in the natural systems across the globe, about 9 to 10 gigatons of emissions are actually pulled out of the atmosphere by these natural systems. A decent number. I mean, it's a large number, but they're actually emitting slightly more than they actually are absorbing because of abuses on the landscape. Because we're seeing more, whether it's deforestation in the tropics or grassland losses in the US or forests not being managed well or forests being ravaged. And I wanted to talk about this today with all of you because we have to figure out a way to change this paradigm. Because if we don't figure out a way to drive investment into our natural resources, and look, they're different, right? You don't have an immediate rate payer. The way you monetize the ecosystem services, there's a little different. There's clean water benefits. There's health benefits. There's obviously carbon benefits. But in an environment where we don't have a clean carbon market, there isn't a place to sell a lot of these credits. And there's obviously been challenges with some of the natural resource credits in the past. But this is a big part of the conversation that often gets ignored. And if you look at the commitments that most countries made, forests, and for that matter, oceans, were often just kind of an afterthought. In the US example in particular, the US assumed basically that emissions would be going down slightly. And as I mentioned before, they've actually been going up. The ability to hit those targets, even say before Administrator Pruitt kind of dismantled the Clean Power Plan as he's trying to kind of roll back a lot of these rules, the ability to hit those targets was actually very much in question because specifically the amount of emissions coming off the landscape was growing fairly rapidly. And the Obama administration, by their own accord, basically said, oh, we can't even get above 21%, let alone to 28%, unless we actually do a better job on the landscape. And so I wanted to bring this up with all of you because it's not the traditional kind of investing that people think of, right? And I can talk about the 48 pounds per tree that's kind of captured and kind of the rates of reforestation. Wetlands are a huge area of opportunity. We've been working with the Nature Conservancy looking at ways to actually restore wetlands as being huge carbon sinks that also have huge clean water benefits. But the reason I wanted to talk about with all of you is that there's very few solutions out there that address both the mitigation side of the equation and the adaptation side of the equation simultaneously. And I want to take you back to 2012 when we were facing Hurricane Sandy. And I was in Delaware, and Delaware was one of the states that was right in the path of destruction. And we did have some big impacts. But the difference compared to most places is that because we had healthy wetlands, because we had healthy dunes, because we had healthier forests, we had a fraction of the damage of other places. These natural systems worked. These natural systems were able to absorb the wave energy. They were able to reduce the velocity and the volume of water. You didn't see the catastrophic damage in Delaware, even though it was on the exact same storm track of states that got hit a lot harder, Maryland to the south, and obviously New York and New Jersey to the north. And so the reason I bring this up is that these are investments that I'd like to figure out ways to work with all of you and try to figure out ways to monetize the benefits to try to drive the investment. Because the cost efficiencies are actually extremely high. See how I'm doing here? I talk so fast, I never use all the time. I breathe occasionally. We need to figure out a way to monetize these investments and basically price them into the marketplace where folks see them as better investments. Most of the work that's being done right now at scale, most meaningful work that's being done at scale is actually coming from the philanthropic community, which is fantastic. It's absolutely amazing looking at what the Moore Foundation and many others are doing, trying to reduce the rates of deforestation. We've seen some big successes. But it's not enough just to play defense. We actually have to play offense in a major way. And so the epilogue to the story I told before about the Forest Service spending their money, even in this kind of current political environment, there was an amazing bipartisan agreement that was just forged in the US Congress to basically ensure that the Forest Service has enough money for proactive restoration, tens of billions of dollars over the next 10 years, to make sure that our forests are healthier, make sure that we're replanting native trees and making sure we're making watersheds healthy, reducing the amount of sediment that's winding up in waterways, really making these systems more resilient. And actually at the same time doing more active management, making sure we're removing dead trees, down trees that could potentially become a tinderbox and still allowing the natural processes and not losing too many of the nutrients. But that's $10 to $20 billion over the next 10 years. That will almost be a 50% increase in the amount of investment in these kind of natural capital assets. It's a big jump. And so the reason I wanted to come to AREDAY and the reason I was so excited when Sally asked me is that many of you are making investment decisions. Many of you are advising different foundations on where to invest. We have to fix this inequity. The Doris Duke Foundation has probably been doing some of the most thinking about it, and there's several others as well. But this is one of the fastest, cheapest, most collaborative ways to get massive reductions, particularly in this environment of political polarization. There aren't a whole lot of folks on the political spectrum that oppose reforesting areas. There aren't a lot of folks that kind of oppose restoring wetlands in meaningful ways. Now, absolutely there's conflicts over development, and there's things like the renewable fuel standard and the ethanol policies in the US that are decimating grasslands and causing us harm on the landscape. But this is the kind of thing that, if done at scale, not just in the US and across North America, but around the world, could actually move the needle in a huge way. And so, you're going to you have so many amazing technology kind of proposals before you and all the different ideas. We just can't forget about nature. And as a Ranger Rick kid growing up, and someone who loves hiking in this region and fly fishing, we can't afford to destroy our natural resources as we're trying to solve and save the planet in the climate crisis. And so the very last thing I wanted to mention before my time was up is that I would love to work with all of you trying to find ways to make sure that the natural resource impacts from clean energy are absolutely minimized. Now, I'm not going to pretend like some folks that the status quo is at all acceptable, right? We got folks in the administration that kind of create these false equivalencies. But there are impacts that can be avoided. There's impacts on marine mammals, there's impacts on migratory birds, there's impacts on a whole range of species. And so the question for all of you is there a way simultaneously to have a clean energy future that's also wildlife friendly? Right now, 1/3 of all wildlife species in America are at risk of potential extinction in the next 15 to 30 years. 1/3. This is kind of our part of the sixth extinction. Right now, only 4% of all the mammals on Earth are wild. We're about 30%, livestock's the rest. Only 4%. So I believe very strongly that we can't solve the climate crisis unless we also kind of heal the Earth and make sure that we actually address these natural resource issues. And the natural solutions, the co-benefits are unbelievable. You think about the co-benefits for water quality, for resilience, for healthier soils, for more productive local communities, for tourism. They're absolutely massive, but they're getting short shrift because they're not quite the shiny objects. I once gave a speech, and we were comparing different technologies, and they're talking about some of the next generation carbon sequestration technologies, kind of pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And I sarcastically said, I got a great invention. It's been perfected over millions of years. It pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, it pushes out oxygen. I talked about the value for water quality and the value even just for human health. And the person somehow, it's kind of a Silicon Valley type, and they looked at me and said, well, what is this technology and how has it been perfected for so long? It was a tree, right? And so just as we're having these conversations, let's just not forget about nature, because one of the challenges that we have is that we could not easily, but we could potentially swap out a dirty energy system for a clean energy system that actually doesn't address many of the biggest natural resource crises we face and actually doesn't improve kind of the equity and justice around the world. And so if we actually do this in a meaningful way and actually think about the natural resources up front, think about the impacts on health, and optimize across those different variables, the suite of solutions is very different. And so as you're going home, if you just remember 2 things for me today, please try to remember that right now less than 2% of all investment in climate mitigation solutions is in natural solutions. That number should be closer to 40%. And please remember that right now 1/3 of all of America's wildlife's in trouble, and together through collaboration and these kind of smart investments, we can bring them back. Thank you very much for having me. Have a wonderful time here at AREDAY.